Good evening, everybody. I'd like to welcome everyone and thank you very much for attending this evening, whether in person or online. My name is Sheila Taylor, and I'm a member of the committee of the Quaker Socialist Society, which has been organising this annual lecture at the time of yearly meeting since 1996. The lecture is a tribute to Ada and Alfred Salter, an inspirational Quaker couple who lived in Bermondsey at the beginning of the 20th century and transformed some of the worst slums in London with their visionary housing, public health, and beautification policies. The Salters were perfect examples of Quaker faith in action. Ada was surrounded by the magnificence and wealth of London, but she saw below the surface the underlying, as she said, vast morass of sorrow and misery, of poverty and struggle. Alfred described socialism not in party political terms, but as a great faith prompted by a great religious motive and inspired by a great humanitarian spirit. When I moved to Bermondsey myself in 1999, I was astounded to discover the Salters. Few people seemed to have heard of them. Quaker Faith and Practice contains no quotations from either of them. We hope each year that this event will make the Salters and their ethical socialism more widely known. So this evening, I'm delighted to introduce our 2025 lecturer, Abimbola Johnson. Abimbola is an award-winning human rights barrister who practices from Doughty Street Chambers. She read law at Oxford and was called to the bar in 2011. She works in criminal defence, inquests, public inquiries, and actions against the state. In 2021, she was appointed to chair the Independent Scrutiny and Oversight Board, tasked with monitoring the implementation by the police of a national action plan to tackle racism in policing. I met Abby last October at a Police Black History Month event in Southwark. She was there speaking about her role of scrutinising the police, about the handling of public protest, and about the management of the Met Police in London. She mentioned that her work was informed by her faith as a Quaker. When Abby accepted our invitation to deliver the 2025 Salter Lecture, she chose the title, Pausing the Police. By an extraordinary coincidence, this topic hit the headlines in March when 20 police officers broke into Westminster Meeting House, armed with tasers, and arrested 6 young women planning protests against the climate crisis and the war in Gaza. We would like to welcome Abby very warmly to give us her insights into policing. The evening will be run in the Quaker tradition with no applause, but there will be some time for questions, and it will end when the people on the platform shake hands. So we will now begin with a short silence, and Abby will start to speak when she is ready.
Hello everyone. It's probably a shorter pause than you normally have at the start of a lecture, but I've been having thoughts about this lecture for the past few months and just quite eager to get started. Sheila, can I drop you for some water? Fine, thank you. I wanted to begin by just acknowledging the honour of delivering this lecture in the name of the Salters, Alfred, a Quaker, an MP, a doctor, and a pacifist whose vision for justice transcended punishment itself, and Ada, a fantastically inspirational woman who embodied the principles of putting her faith into practice, living with conviction, championing women's rights, fighting against the squalid conditions of slums, and going on to become the first female mayor in London. It was quite clear after reading through Graham's book about Ada Salter that her vision and motivation in turn pushed Alfred to achieve what he did. As you've heard, Sheila asked me to deliver this talk last year after we met at a Black History Month community event, and I was very hesitant. Although I subjectively do identify as a Quaker, I don't attend a regular Quaker meeting, and so my journey into Quakerism is very much in its infancy. However, after meeting a few times, she persuaded me to do the lecture this year, so I hope that my talk today honours the legacy not just of the Salters, but also the amazing speakers who have delivered this lecture in previous years. I was drawn to Quakerism at a point in my life where I felt increasingly distant from the church. I was disheartened by what I felt was a disconnect between the things that my faith motivated me to try to take action against versus the messages which were actually being emphasised in the sermons of the churches that I had grown up in and increasingly sporadically attended. In my legal practice, I was also becoming disheartened. I'd started off in criminal defence, and although I felt my work had a positive impact in the specific cases that I was instructed on, I still felt as though I was a cog in the wheel of a system that was ultimately quite unfair. On top of that, I developed an anxiety from the news, predominantly from the American news. The names of unarmed black people being shot by the police would sit in the back of my mind. Eric Garner, Freddie Gray, Philando Castile, Alton Sterling, Breonna Taylor, Tamir Rice, Tanisha Anderson, all names that I'd heard, deaths that I'd witnessed, before that of George Floyd. Then I'd go to court, and I'd represent a disproportionate number of black clients who would often tell me stories of how the police had manhandled them when placing them under arrest. Frequently, the lower level cases that I dealt with at the start of my career involved defendants being charged with assaulting a police officer. And in pretty much all of those cases, my client would be acquitted after putting forward a credible defence that the officer that they were accused of assaulting had acted unlawfully, normally by using unreasonable force, which sometimes would even have been captured on CCTV or body-worn video. So the start of my career at the bar involved cross-examining police officers whom I knew to be lying under oath, and that if their lies had been believed, would have resulted in my clients receiving a criminal conviction and potentially ending up in prison. I wanted to be part of a church that was clued into the injustice that I saw and took it seriously, one that was committed to improving the world. So I did what any millennial does when they're looking for spiritual counsel. I turned to Google. And I literally typed in, what church cares about racism, poverty, and climate change? And it told me about the Quakers, whom I was vaguely familiar with, both because of the image of a Quaker on my porridge oats in the mornings, but also because when learning about slavery at school, one aspect of Quakerism that I had been familiar with was the role of Quakerism in its abolition. Since exploring Quakerism, my understanding of both my faith and justice has shifted, and it's made me ask much better questions, not just as a lawyer, but also as a citizen, and as someone who cares deeply about what kind of society we are building. So Sheila asked me to talk today about something relating to an aspect of my work over the last 4 years. And this has involved scrutinising the police's implementation of a national race action plan, the aim of which is to push policing to become anti-racist. After some conversation with her and with her husband, Graham, we settled on a title, Pausing the Police. And this is a title that resonates with me because I hope it reflects how a lot of the tenets of Quakerism align with the work of anti-racism. So what do I mean when I say pausing the police? Now, this isn't necessarily a call to the police's abolition, nor is it a defence of the status quo. It's a call to pause, to stop, to reflect, to breathe before power is exercised. Because we often ask, what should the police do? But we rarely ask, should the police be doing this at all? So a paused institution listens before it acts. It considers before using force or coercion. It's slow to violence, and it's quick to being held accountable. Pausing the police doesn't necessarily mean abolishing them, but it also means you don't ignore the risks and harms in our society that may be caused directly by them. It's a challenge to the idea that speed, force, and control should come first. And it asks what happens when power moves too quickly. Quakerism has traditions of silence, of spiritual reflection, of listening and discernment, of finding clarity, not in noise, but in stillness. As Isaac Pennington is quoted in Quaker Faith and Practice, give over thine own willing, give over thine own running, give over thine own desiring to know or be anything, and sink down to the seed which God sows in the heart. Now, imagine if our public institutions operated with that spirit. Imagine if our police forces learned to listen before they acted. If they didn't ask only, is this lawful, but further, is it just? What I've seen through my board is policing in a crisis mode. That it's not a public safety agency, but a harm management system. Something that enters conversations when things have gone wrong. You call and they come. But even that doesn't happen as frequently or as well as it should. In 2022 to 2023, in burglary matters, some forces took 28 hours to respond to the average call of burglary. The charity Missing People produced a report that detailed parents sharing stories of being completely dismissed by police forces when they reported their young and vulnerable children as being missing. So the idea that there may be a disturbance, a disappearance, or a disaster, and they respond, may not even reflect what policing does at the moment. But even then, that approach may still have serious consequences. Being led by crisis means that police leave very little time for reflection, very little room for strategy, that there's hardly any space within policing for truly thoughtful, anti-racist, ethical leadership. But the best that I've seen in policing is when it's worked collaboratively, when it speaks to the public consistently, not just when people are going through their worst life experiences. The stakeholders who I know that have very positive impressions of the police have similar things in common. They're able to name a specific officer with whom they have a solid interpersonal relationship. they can identify that someone has taken the time to sit down with them and to discuss the remits of police powers, to discuss their concerns, to talk about the factors and the context of behaviour that they think leads to criminality, to see what their local priorities are. When those individuals then see the police doing something that they feel is harmful, they're reassured by the fact that at the very least they have a specific point of contact they can raise this with. However, although I see these pockets of positive relationships with local neighbourhood officers, what I'm yet to see is an institutional backing of that effort. These are relationships that tend to be driven by individual officers or by small teams, officers who find time to put that work in, frequently on top of what is viewed as being their normal duties. When I'm looking at dynamic situations, so this year I've been asked to be as part of the judging panel for the Police Bravery Awards, which consists of each local force submitting through their federation examples of what they view to be the very best of policing. Reviewing and taking part in that judging panel was eye-opening. I saw body-worn videos of incidents from officers who managed to slow down a high-octane, adrenaline-fueled situation using non-violent de-escalation techniques. They read the room, they considered the context of the situation that they were dealing with, and they were able to diffuse it. They paused before reacting, and sometimes that pause was as small as a fraction of a second. But by giving themselves the space to react more calmly, that had an immeasurable, significant impact on the outcome of situations. Now, in our work on my board, we find year after year that policing as an institution, unfortunately, falls into the habit of acting prior to thinking. We've seen it roll out initiatives, plans, pilots, strategies that commonly lack clear metrics or national coordination of best and worst practice, and meaningful engagement with those who are affected by police action. For example, I'll talk about a database which is run by the police. I'll talk about an initiative that we've seen from the Police Race Action Plan, and I'll talk about a common police power which is used by them. So first, the database. The College of Policing is the learning arm of the police, and they host a national practice bank which all local forces can share examples of work that they've undertaken. The forces are meant to evaluate the impact or the efficacy of the work. They upload a short report about it to that publicly available database. And the idea is that other forces or agencies with an interest in criminal justice can then learn from what their colleagues or what other forces have done. Now, for this to work well, you should see examples being shared of initiatives which have worked, but you should also see sharing of initiatives that have failed or have had limited effect. So we check that database regularly. We filter it for initiatives that are meant to impact police delivery against race and ethnicity. And of the 256 examples that are on the website, does anyone want to guess how many show an example of work that has not achieved the desired outcome? None. The second example is from a community event that I attended. The Met recently ran a precision stop and search pilot in London, and this specifically was run in the areas of Lambeth and also in Barking and Dagenham. I attended its first community meeting in Lambeth. Despite the Met having promised to run the pilot with communities, it transpired when we attended that very first meeting that the 6-week pilot was 3 weeks into delivery. They promised that they would share the results of the pilot, and they promised to evaluate it independently. And that was in July 2023. That pilot was promoted by their chief scientific officer, who did a series of media interviews in which he made huge promises about the impressive impact that he anticipated the pilot would have. It also saw the Metropolitan Police's lead on stop and search go to massive media platforms such as the BBC to give very positive, very optimistic interviews about where he thought this pilot would go. We're now in May 2025, and those results have not been published. In the immediate work that we have done in interactions with the Police Race Action Plan Central team, they have started to develop a tool that measures the maturity of force-level delivery of anti-racism outcomes. Now, that sounds like a lot of word salad, but just in normal speak, effectively, if it were to work, this would be the first of its kind. It would be an interactive database that you could put in the name of a police force, put in a desired agreed outcome for anti-racism, and you'd be able to see how far along on the journey that police force has come in terms of delivery. It's novel because normally what you see in policing is them saying that they're going to do or deliver a specific action and then simply telling you whether or not that action is complete. There's rarely an outcome aligned with the action. So it's a principled approach to delivering anti-racism. But it's really, really complicated. The information that sits behind it, the level of detail, the research, the knowledge that you'd need to have to even engage with it, is all quite complicated. And what we witnessed was civil society, organisation representatives, community members, attending workshops with the central team and being asked to answer very detailed questions about these very detailed documents that they had been sent that had very limited resource or infrastructure to engage with meaningfully. So that's an example of policing wanting to do something which ultimately we view as being very positive, but not thinking about the resource and the infrastructure that's needed to be able to engage meaningfully around it. And lastly, I want to deal with a particular use of force that we see, use of power that we see from the police quite frequently, which no doubt you would have heard of, stop and search. We're frequently told that stop and search is an effective and essential tool in policing. This is despite the negative impact that even polite and considerate searches can have on community relationships, especially this is the case in stops which are conducted lawfully but don't need any reasonable suspicion by a police officer. So there is a section of law which allows police officers to search without suspicion if there is a particular public interest and they have the right authority to do so. With those types of searches, there is huge racial disparity, and there are very low figures for them actually arresting anyone as a result of a search or finding anything suspicious on a person. Now, dealing with stop and search generally, in the year ending March 2024, does anyone want to guess what percentage of those stops actually resulted in a police officer finding something on someone? 1%. Oh, it's higher than 1%. We'll give them that. Higher. Guys, you're being, come on, it's a bit... Higher. Higher, but still really bad. Come on. Okay, it's 28%. So in other words, if I put it the other way around, in about 3 out of 4 times that an officer stops someone and searches them, they find nothing. Can you think of any other initiative? If you were at work and someone said to you, I've got this amazing tool, it's really good, In about 3 out of 4 times it doesn't work, but in the 1 in 4 time, you might find this really low level of criminality, because the majority of stops which do result in finding something are small bags of cannabis, which end with a warning, no further action, no arrest. In only 3% of stops do police officers find a weapon. And yet, we are told that it is a necessary tool for the police to use to tackle knife crime. Now, nationally, black people remain 4 times more likely to be stopped and searched by their white counterparts. This is even though the find rate is roughly the same for black people as it is for white people. So in other words, you're not finding more weapons or drugs on black people than you are white people, but you are stopping them 4 times more than you are their white counterparts. So when I've asked the average police officer, what would they consider to be an alternative to stop and search, to deal with the issues that they say stop and search is meant to, they are rarely able to suggest any. When I ask why they view it as an effective tool, rather than, for example, a tool that has some effect, and I highlight the data that shows how often they find nothing, the impact it has on community relationships, rarely are they able to say anything beyond the fact that in the cases they do find a weapon, it means another weapon is taken off the streets. Now, I should also highlight at this point that in law, something can be classified as a weapon even if it is not a weapon per se. So, for example, this glass, if you thought I was about to hit Sheila over the head with it, I'm not, Sheila, don't worry. I would never do something like that to you. It could then become a weapon, right? So finding a weapon in 3% of stops doesn't necessarily mean that they are finding knives or guns or things that you would traditionally put into that category when you think of the word weapon. So I often walk away from those conversations wondering how differently stop and search may be viewed if the police paused and gave themselves space, or were given space, to think about real alternatives, to look at policing more holistically and adopt a more joined up and considered approach when dealing with matters such as weapons and drugs. And it's not for lack of resource. Policing is a multi-billion-pound industry. And yet, it is not innovative, it's not thoughtful, and it's actually not very strategic. So this has often led towards conversations that look at reforming the police, transforming the police, restructuring the police, and sometimes defunding the police. The most radical form of safety is stability. For some, that means not more police on the streets, but rather fewer reasons to need them. So I want to address that phrase head on, defunding the police. It can be a really powerful thought provocation. It captures a wide range of beliefs. For me, I like to use it to pose a question. What should the police be doing? The question that I opened with. But let me just give you a very short history of what defunding the police, where it's come from. In his book, Black Reconstruction in America, first published in 1935, W.E.B. Du Bois wrote about abolition democracy, which advocated for the removal of institutions that were rooted in racist and repressive practices. In that, he included prisons, convict leasing, and white police forces. In the 1960s, activists such as Angela Davis advocated for the defunding or the abolition of police departments. In 2017, in his book, The End of Policing, by Alex Vitali, who described a guide, effectively, for the defunding movement. And there's 4 factors, really, that tend to be common to those thinkers. They highlight the over-policing of marginalised communities, the limitations of police reform, the fact that there is an actual need for alternatives to policing, which are consistently undervalued in society, and yet rarely do you see a proportionate undervaluing of policing. And they go as far as saying, why not imagine it being possible to have a safe society without policing and trying to steer society towards that? So, although there are multiple interpretations of defunding the police, the basic definition is to move funding from police departments and into community resources, such as mental health, housing, social work, early legal advice. Some advocates would reallocate some police funding while keeping police departments. Others would combine defunding with other police reforms, such as better accountability structures, bias training, and so on, while others still see defunding as a small step towards ultimately abolishing police departments and the prison system entirely. In truth, we ask police officers in England and Wales to do everything. They are called out when there is a mental health crisis. They are called out in scenarios where you're probably better having a very advanced and well-trained social worker attend. They are called out to deal with issues in private relationships. They are often called out to deal with the fallout of addiction. And the problem is that they struggle in those roles. And when the police struggles with something, unfortunately, people can get hurt, and quite seriously so. So defunding, or perhaps more precisely reimagining, can simply mean investing in what actually makes communities safe. It means moving money from punishment towards prevention. Because we can't rely on 19th century models for 21st century problems. We need innovation, humanity, and above all, we need institutions that have the courage to stop and ask, is this working? Should it be me? Is somebody else better suited to respond to this situation? And again, that reminds me of Quaker socialist traditions, the idea that the ethical means must always match the ethical ends. If policing looked at the inherent harms of what it was doing, and not just figures, outcomes, statistics, fine rates, would it have a different view about how it communicates when it says it's going to do a pilot, about how it uses powers such as stop and search, about how it provides infrastructure and resourcing when it wants to engage with civil society or communities around a very complex tool that it wants to develop for their benefit. Now, very recently, as Sheila referenced in her introduction, Quakers have seen a direct impact of policing when it comes into its own home. Earlier this month, the police raided a Quaker meeting house in Westminster, and we saw there 30 police officers descend upon a peaceful meeting of 6 young women in a Quaker meeting house. And I thought the statement that was released by the police in relation to this was quite interesting. They said the following: "We absolutely recognise the importance of the right to protest, but we have a responsibility to intervene to prevent activity that crosses the line from protest into serious disruption and other criminality. This was action against those from Youth Demand, conspiring to shut down London including by blocking roads, with all the disruption that would cause to the general public just trying to go about their day-to-day business. Now, people may wonder why that meant a raid was necessary. The intelligence, which appeared to inform the Met's decision, was publicly available. The meeting had been publicly advertised. The stated purpose was referred to in the statement by the Met, had also been publicly stated on Youth Demand's website, and in fact it's still there. In May, it says, in April, Youth Demand will shut London down with swarming roadblocks day after day after day. The same website also explained that they intended to do so through non-violent means. Now, at the very least, you may feel this reflects the idea of action by the police that may technically have been legal, but was it just? Was it right? Was it proportionate? Did they think about the impact on those 6 women being handcuffed, being pushed against a wall with their arms behind them, being taken into cells, into custody, languishing for hours before being able to tell anyone they'd been arrested or being given any access to legal help? Did they think about the impact on the Quaker church to have a place of worship violated like that? Was that where they needed to arrest those women? Right then, right there, like that? Was it thoughtful policing that recognises that the means should also be just and not just the outcome? So I always try, when I speak about the police and the concerns that I have, to both highlight some of the positives that I see in policing, but also the pathway towards change. I wanted to highlight the recommendations that my board made in our report last year. Now, these deal specifically with the Race Action Plan, but I think they translate into wider policing as well. So first of all, we highlighted a concern with the way that the programme team was structured on the Race Action Plan. It was a pyramid. So at the bottom of the pyramid, you had the rank and file officers and members of staff. These were the people who were involved in delivery of the Race Action Plan day in, day out. They knew their roles inside out. They knew what they were doing, not necessarily why they were doing it, but they knew what their priorities were and what they were focusing on. They were the ones who would attend meetings. They were the ones who would speak to community members. But none of them were decision makers. Those decision makers would sit higher and higher up in the pyramid, a pyramid that got whiter and whiter. I know. But the issue wasn't just the colour of the pyramid. It was the fact that there would therefore be a disconnect between the people who were in the room and having direct conversations and those who were making the decisions. That was frustrating, not just for the officers, but also the community members who would attend meetings, who would put forward solutions, who would share concerns, and would leave meetings with a lack of certainty about whether a decision was going to go the way that they felt the meeting had gone, or would be taken out of their hands and be dealt with in a different way entirely because the decision maker had other priorities. It also meant that the structure wasn't really meritocratic. It reflected the ranking structure in policing. You were a senior leader in the Race Action Plan, not because of a history of delivery against anti-racism goals, but because you occupied a certain rank and maybe had attended a requisite equality and diversity course. So we asked them to change that, to be more thoughtful about who should be speaking to community and who should be making decisions, to contemplate what values they really needed their officers to have to deliver against the Race Action Plan, and what they meant by qualifications, recognising that they are dealing with an institution which has been found time and time again to be institutionally racist, and therefore those who've risen to the top of the profession would not necessarily be those best equipped to deal with anti-racism. Our second recommendation was that they should create tangible metrics, because what you can't change, you don't measure. And what you measure, you change. A relatively straightforward task, you might think, but as I've stated, it's not until this year that they're finally devising a tool that measures the maturity of delivery by local forces. We said they should identify clear priorities. Not everything is urgent, but some things are important. Some things are easier to deliver on than others, and showing actual delivery can mean that those who lack trust and confidence in policing can be assured it's being taken seriously. We told them that they should increase stakeholder engagement, particularly with the black communities that the Race Action Plan is aimed at improving experiences for. And that meant speaking to them not just in times of crisis, but consistently. That sometimes it would mean attending a meeting and saying that they didn't have any updates because this work takes a really long time, but maybe they were there just to listen and to understand. We said they needed to develop a national communication strategy to improve transparency so that people got into the habit of speaking directly to them. We said that they should improve the information flow to oversight bodies, that accountability depends on honesty. I don't know how many of you have had to have regular contact with the police, but sometimes your energy can be expended just on trying to find the right person to speak to, or trying to get the document that you were assured at a public meeting would be made publicly available. So by the time you get what you asked for, it's hard to stay motivated enough to engage with it in the way that you had wanted. We also say to them that work needs to be properly resourced, that they can't just rely on people's goodwill, that community members will take time out of their day, will arrange childcare, will take time off from work, will go to meetings that have been announced only days or even sometimes hours before, will change their timetable to attend things. Now, our report stated, and I'll quote from it, that anti-racism work requires specific expertise, and for institutions to change, radical intervention is required with meaningful accountability behind it. When I looked back at those recommendations while writing this lecture, it struck me that something that links every single one of those recommendations is that it requires pausing. They all require time. They all require thought. They all require humility, accepting that you may be a senior leader, but you're not the best person for this particular role is not something that is intuitive for police officers. Policing is not built for that. It's built for immediacy. It's built for releasing a statement and saying in that statement they have the solution and they've already devised an action plan to deal with it, and don't worry, they know best. One of the best responses that I saw from policing while I've been in this role came from the former national chair of the Police Federation of England and Wales, whose name was Steve Hartshorn, and it was in response to the Casey Review. The Casey Review is the report very recently from Baroness Casey, which looked at the culture of the Metropolitan Police, and in which she concluded that the Metropolitan Police is institutionally racist, sexist, and homophobic. And he went against his federation to declare that he was satisfied that policing, not just in the Met, but nationally, is institutionally racist. And he was asked why he'd come to that conclusion in a Guardian article. And he said it's because he sat down, he read every page of Baroness Casey's report. Then he listened to people such as Mina Smallman, whose murdered daughters were photographed by police officers as they guarded her dead daughters' bodies. He listened to the views of his black and brown colleagues, and he came to the conclusion that he had no choice but to accept that policing was institutionally racist. He said, "For me, it's about leadership. It's about being true to who I am and what I believe." He paused, he reflected, he listened, and then he spoke. So what would Quakeresque policing look like? So let's imagine, let's be bold, what would it look like if it embraced Quaker values? First of all, it'd be much quieter. It would centre listening. Officers would be trained not just in law, but in empathy. It would value discernment. Instead of charging in, it would ask, "Does this matter for the police at all?" It would record those incidents in which they respond, but also note that there may be others better suited to deal with those issues. And it would work with decision makers to ensure those agencies are adequately resourced to respond accordingly. It would practice equality and equity, not just in the abstract, but through action that would be reflected in its outcomes. Racism, for example, would be named and then dismantled. It would adopt an attitude, or at least the spirit, of non-violence. Force would be the absolute last resort, and a wider definition of force or violence would be adopted, one that recognises the inherent harm of police interventions, that a lawful search can still be harmful, humiliating, and ultimately is more likely to prove unnecessary than necessary. And finally, it would move at the speed of trust, not headlines, not orders, but trust. But the reality is that to make that happen, so much would need to change. We'd need to see legislative reform that would limit excessive police power. For example, the Criminal Justice Alliance has been pushing for the abolition of suspicionless stop and search. You'd see the creation of local accountability boards that had actual, real teeth, backing from the Home Office, able to use political power, centralised government, to push for proper resourcing, for the sharing of evidence, so that they can call local police forces to account in a meaningful way. You'd see proper funding being put into community alternatives to police-led interventions, rather than a Labour government that asserts that treating low-level antisocial behaviour is a serious form of criminality. You'd see transparent data on all aspects of police use of force, whether that's traffic stops, arrests, anything. And you'd have an institutional culture that values reflection over bravado and defensiveness. Now, as the advices and the queries of Britain yearly meetings say, think it possible that you may be mistaken. If the police took this level of humility to heart as an institution, because I do have to say, I do see that reflected in some of the attitudes and behaviours of individual police officers, but we would be living in a very different society. So none of this is easy. Structural change never is. But I just want to re-emphasise that pausing is not a weakness, it's wisdom. It's an act of courage to stop mid-sprint and ask if you're running in the right direction. I want us to be brave enough to build institutions that pause. I want us to be clear enough to name harm, to be kind enough to believe that justice can look like stillness. I thank you for your time, and I hope that together we can strive towards a society that includes a police service that has learnt to pause, not because it's unsure, but because it is serious. Thank you.